Hello everybody, welcome to the stream. I hope you're having a nice evening. I'm a bit later than I thought I would start this stream and podcast recording. First off, I had to wait for the Drachenlord, the Dragon Lord verdict, which in preparation for a future episode. And then our neighbor decided to be extremely loud, so I had to go up there and I don't know. I think he's not divorced, but his girlfriend left him. I think all during the pandemic, she was crying a lot in the bathroom, which you could hear because the bathrooms are kind of connected. I don't think the architects thought that one through. But anyway, and then she moved out, I think, and now he's just having parties with his friends in the week. Like last time was like Sunday at 4:00. We were there with 4 parties out of the house, and he didn't hear his bell. I actually had to call the police, which I really don't like doing, and I don't like to be being such an old man, really. But my wife actually has to go to work. I mean, I can just recover in the home office, but that was not good. Anyway, I told him. I told him, please turn it down a little bit. And now it seems to be okay. So I can actually also record this podcast with you hearing like a the whole time. I just realized I need to switch my audio device for this recording. So I hope that's not going to break anything. Let us see. No, that seems to work. All right. That seems to work. Let's start the Hindenburg. We're not going to talk about Drachenlord today. That's going to be a future episode. I need to read some more about this, I think. Also, I had this episode all planned. I knew that today was going to be the case, but I wasn't sure. It could have been possibly, it could have been a second day to the proceedings on April the 1st of all dates. So I wasn't sure that the verdict was going to come down today, so I didn't want to schedule an episode for today. But I'm probably going to record that one. I don't know. I'm going to try the weekend because I don't think I'll be able to do it next week. I'll probably be away in the week next week on an assignment, so I can't really record podcast there. But anyway, didn't arm any tracks. That's a rookie mistake. 1, 2, 3. We're testing this. We're testing with my soundboard. Hello.
Опачки, чики-брики, пальчик-выки.
Okay, that's good. Seems to be good. Seems to work. Any tracks? That's a rookie mistake. 1, 2, 3. We're testing this. We're testing with my soundboard. Hello.
Опачки, чики-брики. Пальчик-выки.
Okay, that does seem to work. All right, I'm going to start into the show because I'm already late for today and trying to get it out today. It's probably not going to work, but but we'll see. I want to get into it, as soon as possible. Of course, we're doing a podcast, so the normal ground rules apply. I'm not going to interact with chat as much as I usually do, but I will, and I do appreciate your feedback. So please keep that coming. That's one of the reasons why I recorded live, to get some live feedback, which is helpful. Let's check the date. The date is correct. So I think we can do this. Let's see if I can actually do it. Rewind the tape. You're listening to The Private Citizen, defending your right to have something to hide, a podcast for Critical Thinkers. This is episode 112 for Wednesday, the 23rd of March, 2022. What does Putin want? Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. My name is Fab. I'm your host tonight, and as usual, nice to have you along for this episode. As promised, today I'm going to talk a bit about the war in Ukraine, where it's going, as far as I can tell. And I want to have a particular look at what I think the Russians want in there, because there's I don't think there's not enough reporting on this. Once again, I'm trying to do the reporting that I see is missing. As usual, I'm recording this live on Twitch, and streaming the recording, so to speak, and we'll have some live feedback probably, which is gonna be good. Anyway, thanks for coming along. Before I get into the main part of the show, there are several things I would like to say. So the first is that I might release an episode a bit earlier following this one, and then probably there won't be one on Wednesday next week because I'm away on assignment, probably, and I can't do show, but I'll try to get it to you earlier. That episode will be, if everything goes according to plan, about the Drachenlord, Rainer Winkler, because tonight, actually, just before I started this recording, his sentence has come down, and he's been convicted for a second. It was his second trial. I'm waffling because I'm actually realizing that I need a bumper here because I put it like a subheading into the show notes. I'll just get that out of the way. So here we go. Yes, Drachenlord, his second trial has come down. Well, actually, it really is his third trial, but this is like the retrial of the trial I was talking about. What's that? In November, when I first talked about him. And he has now been convicted to 1 year on probation, which is a bit of a scandal/shock to many. Because that is very seldomly done. Generally, generally, if you're convicted twice for the same, same crime. In his case, aggravated assault, schwere Körperverletzung, usually don't get probation. So I've followed reports from the trial all day today. But I still want to, it's probably good that I'm not going to do an episode on that right away. I still need to do some research on what actually happened during that trial. So I'll do that, and then I'll the next episode is probably going to be about that, because I think it's I talked about the case before. It's a very important precedent. It's, for German jurisprudence and generally for, internet and cyber mobbing, which is a topic close to my heart. Not so much because I was bullied in the past. Cyberbullying, sorry, we call it mobbing in Germany, which is German. Germans are weird. So not because I've been bullied in the past so much, but more because this whole cyberbullying thing and hate speech is being used as a weapon to silence people, I feel. And verdicts like this don't help. And I've talked about the Drachenlord recently in what episode was that? If you go to Private Citizen or Press, which I'm doing right now, there's the show notes. And that was episode 110. That was the last time I talked about this. And I said, I'm going to talk about the trial. So I'm going to do that. But tonight, whatever time it is for you, we're actually doing another episode with something else I promised, which is to keep you up to date on the war in Ukraine. So let's switch to that topic then. And I'm gonna wait. Why didn't that come out on the recording? That is weird. Okay, I'm gonna have to pause it here. I have to fix that in post. I hit the wrong button. That was not good. Let's switch to that topic then. And I don't want to update the software now. Sorry. Right, that didn't play. Well, that's okay. That's okay. That makes it easier for me to fix in post. And we're gonna do just that later. Now I'm gonna hit the right button. All right. So yes, the war in Ukraine. Before I get into this, I have two disclaimers that I have to give. The first is, this reporting is based, to the best of my ability, on independent reporting, i.e., journalists in the field that are, trustworthy journalists, and not on government propaganda from either side. That is incredibly hard to do because it turns out there's very few journalists, independent journalists on the ground. Certainly most of the coverage here in Germany, especially by the state broadcasters, is based on government propaganda. It's based on what the Ukrainians are saying. Now, we're going to probably talk about later, because that'll come up in the feedback, about how the media is treating this conflict. But in Germany, it seems to be largely that basically what the Russians say is taken as propaganda and labeled quite directly as propaganda by my colleagues in the media. And what the Ukrainians say is kind of taken, verbatim, and it's just repeated. They usually say that it's Ukrainian government sources and give a little bit of a disclaimer, but I mean, it's the same propaganda, right? We're in war. Both sides are basically putting propaganda out there. And I have a bit of an issue if you're taking, what Zelensky, the head of the Ukrainian government, is saying and just believing that. Because, I mean, he's in a war. He's in a desperate war from his perspective, I would say. He is, he's being attacked by a huge country with a much superior military, and you do, and it's your duty as the head of state in this situation to do what's best for your country, right? And if that is misdirecting or maybe even lying directly, or at least putting your own forces into the best light possible, i.e. propaganda, then that is what he's supposed to do. And I don't fault him for it. I don't fault the Ukrainians for it. Same as I don't fault the Russians for putting propaganda out there. That's just what you do. I fault journalists who are not critically, asking questions about this. So it's kind of hard to actually get independent sources. So it's already kind of hard to figure out where actually the front lines are and what's happening. There are some independent journalists. A good one is actually the, of all people, I think he's the deputy editor-in-chief of Bild Zeitung, which is the German tabloid, which is a horrible newspaper. They're really bad. They're like the Daily Mail of Germany, probably even worse. I don't read them. I make a point of not reading them. But he's tweeting about stuff as well. And he's actually there. He's in Kiev. He's talking to Zelensky a lot, and he's actually on the front line. And you can say a lot of the Bild reporters, but they do have balls generally. The Bild has balls, and that goes as far as, that might be a slogan. The Bild has balls. Usually that also means that they just make up stories. Sometimes they just have the balls to make shit up. They had very famous things in the past, where they've basically driven people into ruin. I mean, one example is the Swiss German, I don't know if he's actually German, but he was always on the German TV, Jürgen Kachelmann, the weatherman, right, who was being tried for having assaulted his girlfriend or raped her, which never happened, which the court in the end actually, he got acquitted of all charges, but Bild drove a relentless campaign against him for years. I mean, he sued them, he got a lot of money, I think, But it's the same thing. Once the public thinks you're guilty, it doesn't even help if the court frees you of all charges. You're basically guilty. Like if you talk to people on the street today, did Kachelmann rape his girlfriend? I think more than half of them would say yes, probably even like 90% still think he did it, even though he didn't. So, I don't like him. But in this case, this guy, I think isn't his name Paul Ronsheimer? I think he's definitely doing, from what I can see, he's doing good work. He's one of the few people down there who's actually doing things. But even then, he's in Kiev, and it's not really like the front lines are, for example, really hard to figure out. Like one of the reasons here is that also, everybody got caught, like the media got caught completely off guard by this, even though the war had been going on for 8 years, even though the Russians had been massing tanks and troops for weeks, and it was actually reported in the press. They apparently didn't send people down there. Then also, it's not an American war, right? So there's no embedded people there, as you would have for like the Iraq War or whatever. And lots of the journalists that are down there are reporting, a lot of human interest stories, and this is so bad for the refugees, and this is happening here, and this house is being bombed, which I can understand, which is also important. You have to show the horrible realities of war and what it's actually doing to people, but I would think that would be in addition to actually reporting on, where the front lines are and what is actually happening. And the only reporting you see on that is obviously slanted towards the Ukrainians, where it's like, oh, there's another Russian tank destroyed, whatever. To the point, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later here, where I think the German public believes that, the Russians are just losing the war, losing massive amounts of troops and tanks. And I think there's different reasons for that, but I'm going to get into that. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is I did my best to collate independent sources, but with a huge disclaimer that is really hard. And we're in a situation where you really can't so much tell what's going on. I did produce my own map. This is largely based on stuff I've read from those people, I kind of trust. And also, the map itself is based on the Wikipedia map that I had in the previous episode about Ukraine, my first episode about Ukraine, where I was a little bit talking about how the war is going. But that, if you want to go, Private Citizen or Press, obviously, show notes for this episode is I put the map in there. That was episode. I think it was 109. Was it 109? Yes. That was the first episode. I had a map from Wikipedia, which is shows a lot of things in details, but it's very, very hard to read. I feel it doesn't really. There's too much details in there. There's like fucking train tracks and highways and shit you don't need. There's like all these little towns you don't need. All the labels are way too small to read. So I try to improve on that based on their data and what I could correlate, and come up with my own map that's hopefully a bit easier on the eyes and a bit easier to understand, which I'm going to use to try to explain how I think this war is going. This is all based on some research I did over the last few days. I wrote a story on this, which I published this morning. I have a newsletter on Substack now called Realpolitik at realpolitik.news. I wrote a very long story about all of this, which I'm going to kind of summarize on the show. I kind of want to bring this on the show as well. I often do that. I write articles and then I can kind of talk about it on the podcast as well, because all the research is done. So that's what we're kind of doing today. Another disclaimer I have to think. I don't think. Thanks Mortality on the show, by the way, for telling me here as Paul Ronsheimer that I got the name correct. That's pretty good. Thank you. So I see this white Twitch chat and live recording. This is helpful. I have to give another disclaimer, which is what I'm gonna try to do today is with very little emotion and as analytically as possible, trying to see what the Russian and Putin's goals are. I don't think I have to explain this to you if you've been listening to the show for long, but if you know me and you know where I'm coming from, but there are people who listen to this episode the first time, and they might get if I just launch into this, they might get the opinion that I'm either I have no emotions or I'm actually pro Putin, right? I don't really think I have to give this disclaimer, but I will do it anyway. I abhor wars. I'm against all kinds of wars. I kind of dodged the draft in Germany because I was declared medically unfit. If that hadn't happened, I would have tried my best to get out of the compulsory military service that we had back when I was 18. I would have done civilian service. When I was younger, I was very much a pacifist. I'm not that anymore. I've studied politics and history extensively, and I understand that there are some wars that have to be fought. Very good and easy examples, World War II, to some extent, right? But wars have to be fought. But I'm still very much against wars. I'm against supporting wars by producing weapons, which Germany is largely guilty of by selling them to other countries and stuff like that. So I'm against war, and I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. This is an obviously aggressive invasion that is horrible, right? Some people are calling it an illegal invasion. I don't know how it's. I'm gonna probably have to do an episode on international law. Like what we in Germany call Völkerrecht. I don't know. I actually didn't look that up in before I did the show. What's that? Völkerrecht. What would that be in English? Let me just quickly look this up. Public international law. Yeah, I think law of nations, that kind of thing, right? Which isn't really law, right? There's no court, there's no fixed rules. So calling something like this illegal is beside the point, I think. But I think it's abhorrent and it's clearly morally wrong. I don't want anybody to think, just because I'm now going to try to analyze this whole thing without emotion as much as I can, that I don't have those emotions, and that I don't think what Putin is doing here and the Russian military is doing here is horrible and abhorrent, and I'm very much against it. What that doesn't mean is that I'm for sending weapons to Ukraine, for example, because I also don't want to prolong this war and make it worse, and I think this is bad. I'm also not for a NATO intervention, because that will just escalate everything. And what we need now is de-escalation. We need diplomacy. We need cool heads. We need countries. I really like what Macron was doing with France, right? To some extent, for some reason, Erdogan is involved in Turkey. But like, we need that kind of thing. We need to get these people to talk and find a solution that will stop the war. That is what I strongly believe. So, just so that you don't misunderstand me, the reason why I'm trying to do this without emotion as much as I can is because everything I read every day, and I'm a professional journalist, I read the news every day. I read a lot of sources in Germany, German sources, English sources, US sources, all kinds of stuff all over the world. And everybody, as far as I can tell, is reporting on this very emotionally, which has its place. It is, as I said, it is important to show the consequences of war. But I feel like that's being done too much, right? And it tends to whip up people in frenzies where they go like, a good example was 2 weeks ago or whatever, where we need a no-fly zone over, we need to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, right? Which people just, yes, that's the right thing to do. We need to stop this war, but they don't think, right? They just react emotionally. They don't think about the situation. They don't realize that enforcing a no-fly zone means, okay, so if a Russian plane flies in there, you have to shoot it down, right? Which would mean if the Germans or the US enforces this no-fly zone and shoots down that plane, they would enter the war, right? We would then enter a war with Russia. So there's a lot of this stuff going on, and I don't want to be part of it. I want to try to have a calm analysis here. That being said, let's get into it. I mean, if you have a browser handy, go to privatecitizen.press and look at the map. I've put in the show notes, so you can kind of follow along. So this is my theory. This is what I think. I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert on Ukraine. I'm not really an expert on Russia. I studied a lot of. I mean, I don't finish university. I didn't finish my MA. So, I'm a nobody who knows nothing. But I did study for several long years modern history of Europe, specifically the 19th century, the 18th and 19th centuries, where, of course, I know a lot about European foreign policy in that era, in the Bismarck era, with Russia. And even though the countries have changed a little bit, a lot of that is still comparable, I think. Obviously, yes, I studied World War II, and I do know quite a lot about the politics afterwards. But yeah, so this is where I'm coming from, right? So I'm seeing it like this. So if you want to analyze what does Putin want, what are his possible war goals here, I see only 3 different goals, possible ones. And I'm kind of going to list them in descending order of how hard they. So the first one would be like the hardest to achieve for the Russians, and then descending order. So the first one would be full-on conquest. This would be, kind of old school war, conquering and occupying the whole of Ukraine, or as much of the country as needed to subdue the country and its military, with the goal of making it a puppet state. Either that or even annexing it and making it a part of the Russian Federation, kind of like the Ukrainian SSR was in the Soviet Union. I think the second goal the second possible goal would be toppling the government, which would mean invading Kiev, and then forcing a surrender of the military forces in a way that you can then get the government to surrender and step down, and then installing a Russia-friendly regime, right? That would keep Ukraine as Ukraine, but you would install somebody who is friendly to the Kremlin. And then the third possibility would be forcing neutrality. That would entail, fighting the country's military forces or the important, strategically important military forces to stand still, or affecting so much civilian casualties to get the current government, so you wouldn't change the government necessarily, to commit to neutrality. So obviously all of these goals have different prerequisites, and there are a different scale of difficulty that you would, if you, from the viewpoints of the Russians, to achieve them. They all have one thing in common, which is relatively easy to see, which is to varying degrees, but mostly negate NATO's influence on the country, right? I mean, the first one would completely negate it, and the second and the third possibilities would significantly negate it. Now, this brings me to kind of a fourth, which is kind of a fallback goal. I don't think you can count it as a war goal, but because in my opinion, I'm going to explain why I think that is, Putin has already reached it. I think he kind of reached it by launching this invasion, or maybe even in 2014 by annexing Crimea and, starting the whole war in Donbass. So that would be to occupy the east of the country, right? So permanently occupy as much of the somewhat pro-Russian regions there, which would effectively prevent NATO from joining this war, or Ukraine basically would prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, because it would mean that because there was an ongoing war or parts of the country are occupied by the Russians, bringing Ukraine into NATO at this point would mean you're basically putting a country into the alliance that is already being attacked, which would cause NATO to respond, which would immediately mean World War III. Probably fought with nuclear weapons, which would mean it would end it all. So I kind of feel like that's something they've already achieved, but I'm going to get into that later. So let's get into the different war goals in that same order, right? Let's talk about full-on conquest first. I think this is generally what, especially the media in Germany kind of presupposes is Putin's goal. I don't think it is. So this would mean you would have to capture basically the whole country, i.e., you would have to make military resistance by the Ukrainian military unfeasible, and then turn the country either into a puppet state or make it part of the Russian Federation. This means specifically that you cannot only conquer Kiev and topple the government, because history teaches us that, like, even with the government in exile or captured or whatever, it is conceivable that the Ukrainian military just keeps the command structure intact and continues fighting the war. So you'd have to also, so it wouldn't be enough to capture Kiev. You'd basically have to capture the whole country. Then you'd have to subdue the regular Ukrainian military, but that wouldn't even be, I feel, the hardest. Like, that wouldn't be all of it, right? That wouldn't be the main difficulty, because even if you did that and you occupied the whole country as the Russians, you have to be prepared for insurgents, basically guerrilla warfare on part of the Ukrainians, which they have prepared for ever since this whole thing started in February. They've been handing out guns to civilians en masse. They've been forming militias. So I also think this, what you're seeing reported as the willingness of the Ukrainians to fight insurgency war like this is not Ukrainian propaganda. There is propaganda to that effect, but I do think that is a real thing. I think there's enough national pride and hatred there that I believe the Ukrainians would actually do this. And I think the Russians know this. And I think the Russian army, both the army of the Russian Federation as well as the Red Army back in Soviet times, have significant experience with this. The Russian army in the Chechen conflicts, and of course also the Red Army in the Soviet-Afghan war. They know how hard it is to do something like this. You can capture the country, but there can be insurgencies for decades, which is very costly. They can just make you bleed. So while I think that given enough time, it's pretty much inevitable that Russia wins this war, simply just because of the size of their military. Russia has in terms of manpower, it's the 5th largest military in the world. It's about 10 times as big as the Ukrainian military. It has, I think, in reserves, it's like number 3. I think they have double the reserves than Ukraine has. And they know how to leverage this, right? They know how to, Russia historically, not only in World War I and World War II, but even before that, historically their approach to warfare has been very much just throwing people and equipment at a problem and just not giving up. And by sheer momentum and overwhelming force, they just win in the end. And they know that. They know how to leverage that. That is pretty much the Russian military tradition. And everything they do is kind of built into that, right? They when the West builds a tank that's high tech and expensive and has everything, then the Russians just build 4 tanks that are cheaper, not as good, but you have 4, right? Where the Western army, in the Cold War, the Americans built the M16 rifle or whatever, right? And now the M4, a very, very high-tech, very precise weapon. The Russians just built the Kalashnikov, which was famous to be just stamped fucking metal parts that you could mass produce. It might not be as reliable. It might not be as last as long, but you can just make 10 times the guns in the time it takes you to build one M16, probably. So their approach has always been that. So I think that it's conceivable, with the Russian general staff being largely a holdover. A lot of these people are still from the Soviet times in the Red Army. I still think that they know this, they have this skill. And so I feel, I think it's pretty much inevitable. But I also think they know it's been clear that Ukraine's been galvanized and that they will fight a guerrilla war if they have to. And I think the Russians know this. I think as clear as it is that they can just win this war and just grind down Ukraine, presupposing that NATO doesn't get involved, and just grind them down. I think it's in the same time it's as inevitable that they will get bogged down in this insurgency warfare, which they don't want because they have experience of that and they know how costly that is, right? And Putin was involved, like in the Chechen conflicts. He took over the government from Yeltsin during the Second Chechen War, so he knows how hard that was on his military and how costly that was. And I think while Putin, you can say these many things, you could. I wouldn't even generally I don't like calling people evil because, it kind of presupposes that they're not human or something. I don't know. But I think it could be argued that you could call him evil, certainly morally bankrupt. But I don't think he's naive. I don't think he's naive or dumb. So I think he knows this. And for this reason, I think that this is not actually his goal. And, it is not the goal of his military either. But another reason that makes me think that, if you look at the approach of the just how the Russian military has attacked Ukraine, right? Both the where how they are set up, like from where they attacked, in the east and the north, and how they did that, and how they're advancing on Kiev, but also how they're consolidating the Donbass. I think if their goal would have been to conquer the whole country, I think the smartest approach, and I think they know that, would have been a blitzkrieg kind of approach, right? The thing that Hitler did with Poland in World War II, i.e. catch the enemy off guard and then drive use elite forces, use your best forces to catch the enemy off guard, and then relentlessly drive that approach. I mean, if you want to listen to some music after this, you might want to listen to Ghost Division by Sabaton, which kind of explains this whole German tactic from World War II. Use mobile forces and just capture territory. And press that advantage. Never let the enemy get back on their feet and catch their balance. You'd have to press. To do that, you need elite and very good forces. And certainly the Russians caught the Ukrainians off guard. I'm pretty sure they caught everybody off guard. They caught politicians in Europe off guard, and they're pretty much, as far as we can tell, entered the country pretty much unopposed. The Ukrainians weren't able to stop them at the border. Which is somewhat surprising because, we had, for 2 weeks, we had reports in the media that the Russians were massing materiel and people at the border. And I'm thinking that our intelligence services and the Ukrainian intelligence services probably must have known this longer than the press did. There was the Spiegel story with the invasion plan going around and all of that. So they were still caught off guard. Now, I think the Russians would have relentlessly pressed this and tried for speed if their goal would have been to capture the whole country, because it's the only way you can do this. Because once the other you can do it, over decades or years as well in a long drawn out war. But if you can do it in kind of a blitzkrieg approach, you would do that. But their military, if you see how they invaded from. They in the north, kind of from Belarusia, they started directly towards Kiev, right? They captured Chernobyl, the power plant, pretty quickly, and then drove down, and the Ukrainians kind of drove them back. So that's not really an indication. But if you look how they advanced from the south and the east, they didn't advance into the country so much. They went north a little bit, but they mostly went towards the Donbass, right? And they consolidated the separatist held areas, as far as I can tell, with regular Russian forces. Also, if you look at what kind of equipment and people they use, this is not like a veteran, kind of an elite setup, right? So, for example, the Russians have a tank, the T-14 Armata, which is arguably the most modern main battle tank in the world. It's the next current generation, like it's a next generation tank. The Japanese have a new one as well, but like it's generally, we don't really know its capabilities because it's never seen on a battlefield. But it's generally supposed that this is the most modern tank. It's certainly more modern than, the German Leopard 2, the Abrams, anything like that. It is high tech, modern, and they are in the process of replacing their T-90s with this. But this tank has never been seen in Ukraine at all. Now, Western observers are saying that's because they do not have enough of them. I'm not quite sure. Like, even if you had like one Panzer battalion, I won't say because I listen to Sabaton so much, had one battalion of these, you probably, if you tried for a blitzkrieg attack and you tried to conquer very like strategically important targets, you probably would have used this tank. But the Russians haven't been using it. They've been using, T-90s, and, to some extent, even T-72s. Now, the T-90 is like the current generation tank. That's kind of like a Leopard 2 or an Abrams. The T-72 is hopelessly outdated. That's like a previously generation tank. That's also why they've been losing them left and right? Because you can kind of basically pop that with a World War II almost Panzerfaust kind of thing. So they're not being using their elite forces. Same goes for their the soldiers and the small arms they're carrying. Like if you're really interested in this and you want to look into this, you can go to my newsletter. I've linked the post, and I've got lots of links in there. One of them is to a video by Brennan Herrera, who's like kind of a gun guy who just is looking at guns the Ukrainian and the Russians are using in the conflict. And he points out that like the Russians, there's a guy, he has a picture that went around the internet of a Russian soldier in Ukraine using a Mosin Nagant. The Mosin Nagant is also known as the rifle M1891 because it was introduced in 1891. So we are talking a rifle that is well over 100 years old that somebody's using in the current conflict. He also points out that while they're using the AK-12 quite a lot, which is the modern, Kalashnikov rifle that the Russian forces are using, it's basically a Kalashnikov, traditional Kalashnikov that that's been modernized, including which Brandon talks about. One of the I mean it still looks like a Kalashnikov, but it has like a modern stock. It looks very much like an M4 pretty much. It has like a Picatinny rail on top, which Kalashnikovs never had. If you're not into guns, this is kind of like an attachment system that you can put like scopes on and stuff. And the whole point of this modernized Kalashnikov is that you can do that. Right, on an old, like if you look at the predecessor, which is an AK-74, this is what most people think of when they call it an AK-47. The AK-47 hasn't been in use for, when you're talking about the Cold War Russian Warsaw Pact rifle, you're talking about an AK-74, right, which is the modernized 47. It's also different. It doesn't really matter. It's like, but if you look at that, it's the Kalashnikov everybody knows, from the RAF, the German terrorist organization logo, and that very much just has iron sights and it doesn't have anything you can attach anything on. Whereas like modern rifles, like the American, the M4 and stuff like that, they have these Picatinny rails and you could put lasers on and like night vision devices and all this kind of stuff, which like modern militaries do. Now, it's very conspicuous, says Brendan Herrera, which, he knows what he's talking about, that the Russian soldiers are using these rifles, the AK-12, and they're being captured left and right by the Ukrainians, but they don't have any accessories on there, right? Which just doesn't make any sense, because that's why you use that rifle, right? That's its major improvement. Otherwise, it's just, you might as well use an AK-74. It has a free floating barrel, which is like a new thing, but it's largely the same gun. So basically, what they're doing is they're handing out these rifles, but they're keeping the accessories. As far as we can tell, they're keeping the accessories in reserve or something. Kind of like they're good tanks. So what I'm trying to explain here is what I think is that this doesn't look like an operation where you'd go, I want to cover as much territory as possible with my fastest tanks. It can't be stopped, with my best equipped soldiers. Also, they're using, we had reports that the Russians are using actually drafted, drafted recruits, people from the draft, who were told, oh yeah, you're going on maneuvers in Belarus, and then suddenly they're in the war, right? So they're not using the elite equipment, they're not using elite forces, they're keeping stuff back. And I think that makes sense. It also makes sense with the approach the military has been using, because all of this looks to me like they're going for war goal number 2, which is toppling the government, right? Because it looks like they're just going for Kiev, trying to, invade Kiev and get government kicked out. And for that, it actually makes sense if you're not using your top troops, your top tanks, because speed is not so much of the issue there. Basically, you're trying to do you're trying to affect a political change, and it'd be actually a bonus if you can do that without even conquering the capital. So if you're just causing massive, this sounds heartless, but that's what war is. If you're just trying to cause, and I think this is how Putin thinks, cause massive civilian casualties and just break the country's will, you might even get the government to resign or whatever without actually conquering the capital. Also, that there's really no reason to go in there fast, because that the capital is well defended, that's where the defense is, and that by the time you get there, they can repel that. So your best goal there is just to go slowly, to destroy as much as you can, and just destroy their will to fight, and then at that point you can just, if this war takes 2 years, who cares? If you're Putin. Especially I think they just don't care about casualties, and because that's how the military thinks, and I think especially the Russian military, they don't care about how many people die of their own people, and they don't care about their fucking tanks, because the T-72s, if they weren't using them in this war, they would be scrapping them or selling them off to Africa. They're just not usable anymore. If you fight you can see, even if you're fighting the Ukrainian military, which has T-90 tanks, right, from the Russians back in the day, even then you're losing quite a lot. But if you're a cold-hearted Russian general, you'd rather use them in the war and get some bang out of it before you're just scrapping them anyway. Same with the T-90s. The T-90s are in the process of being replaced by the Armata, right? The T-14. So why not use them? Otherwise, you'd have to get rid of them anyway. And I think it's just smart, if you're Putin and you're waging a war, to keep that stuff in reserve, because your worst case scenario is that NATO could get involved, and let's say we don't have a nuclear war, we have a conventional war. You'll need those T-14s, you need those Kalashnikov attachments, and you need your Spetsnaz special operations or veteran troops to fight the NATO people, right? To fight the Americans if they decide to invade Russia or whatever. So I think they're keeping that in reserve, which is smart. I haven't studied military history. I only studied history and older wars, but You know this even if you play like, as dumb as it sounds, but even if you play, strategy games, if you play video games or board games or Warhammer, you know this, right? You have to you keep some stuff in reserve, and especially in real life, because you need some stuff to defend Russia if push comes to shove. So I think they just don't care about these losses. So they can just take it slow and basically try to grind down Ukraine. That what it looks to me like they're doing, right? I think that was Putin's goal all along, to just get in there, topple the government, install a Russia-friendly government, and then, probably occupy, I would say, the Donetsk, the Donbass, the Donetsk and the Luhansk People's Republics, occupy that, make that part of Russia, and Crimea, and maybe some other pieces in the east, and then you just don't need the rest of Ukraine, right? That can be its own independent country, kind of like Vichy France was, right? The part of, especially the part of France that Germany didn't occupy, right? You kind of don't need that. You can just leave that and like install a government that is kind of friendly to you, and then like, why conquer? Like, from the point of view of Putin, you don't need to conquer. I don't think he wants Ukraine. I think that's a Western misinterpretation. That's the whole, he wants to reinstate the Soviet Union. I think that's just completely wrong. I think the guy is his morals notwithstanding, I think he's a realpolitik guy. He thinks, I don't know, I wouldn't say I understand him, but I think I understand him better than many journalists that are covering this, because like, if you've studied Bismarck and you've studied that era, this is exactly how people thought back then. They didn't have any like this convoluted, stupid idea of international law and what today we think, people who run states are not that Machiavellian anymore and morals are involved. Like, that's not how they thought. Like, Bismarck literally started 2 wars to unify Germany. Right, he knew he had to fight Denmark, he knew he had to fight France, and that was his only chance. And he wasn't thinking about, is it morally wrong to attack another country and, have my soldiers die in battle? That's just not how they thought back then. Or have civilians die, or, invade another country and kill people there. That's not how politicians thought back then. They were just like, this is war, and this is like for the good of my country. And I think that's how Putin thinks as well. He just doesn't think about this morally. He thinks, from his perspective, he's under threat by NATO and he needs to solve this situation in Ukraine. And that's the only way he can reliably do this. And if you think about it that way, like, why conquer the whole country? You don't need that. You'll just like have to hold it, and then the fucking insurgency and fucking losses everywhere. No. You consolidate the East, you consolidate the position there, you press, you give them the understanding that they can't stop you because you're fucking Russia and your military is 10 times bigger, and then you advance on Kiev and you grind down their resistance, and then you just take over the government. I think that is his goal pretty much. And I to me, how this, like, from what I can tell, what I can figure out how the war is going, it holds up to that. Also, what jives with that is their propaganda idea. Like the Russian propaganda story is that there's no war at all. This is just a limited special military operation in Donbass, right? And that would, like, if they actually captured all of Ukraine, it would call that propaganda line a lie. I mean, it's not to say that wouldn't be something they would do and could happen, but like, why do that if you can just like, they're basically saying, we need to pacify like Donbass because there's Russian citizens there, or Russian aligned citizens. We have a responsibility to rescue them, or whatever, their fucking warped propaganda line is. and the government in Kiev is suppressing them, so we need to conquer them and reinstall like a proper government. And I mean, there are even, it's not like, I mean, I did a lot of research on Ukraine in the last few weeks, and you do find things that, like, there people in the East had legitimate grievances, that, the Ukrainians have become very nationalistic in recent years, that there were, I read a story by like a correspondent who was in Ukraine just before 2014, and writing a lot about how there were people living in the East who were Russian, who were speaking Russians. That was their main language, and the Ukraine started enforcing that there was no Russian taught in schools, and that the schools were all only teaching Ukrainian, and that those kids then couldn't understand what was happening in school. Which I have a grandmother who's 100 years old, and I talk to her a lot. I've done so for decades, and she always reminds me of, like, she always tells me the story, because it's very, very painful to her. When she was in school, she lived in Pomerania, which is in the north, on the Baltic. It's now part of Poland, used to be part of Germany. I.e., when my grandmother was born in 1921, it was part of Germany. And then obviously became part of, or it was part of Germany before that, and then became part of Poland when she was growing up. And I think it was already part of Poland when she was growing up, or like parts of it were, I don't know. Anyway, but she was in school, and she was in an area that used to be Germany and was majority German, and they all spoke German. They spoke German in schools, and then the Polish people decided suddenly, for political reasons, that there wouldn't be any German in school, and they switched the school to Polish. And from one day to the other, my grandmother couldn't understand the word they were saying in school. And my grandmother's the most peaceful person you would ever meet. Like, she's the most endearing, lovely person. But, like, you can tell that, like, even she was back in the day when she was a kid. Like, this is how you breed discontent, right? This is how this is shit like this is why Hitler then, with his hate and his aggression, actually got people on board. It's same with this. Like, you can't. I'm not trying to excuse that Putin invaded, right? I'm not trying to excuse that Hitler killed millions of people, but you have to, if you want to understand history, you have to understand these things, right? It's not like the NATO expanding east. I talked about this on a previous episode. That's NATO's not at fault for Putin invading, but, like, if you want to understand why all this happened, it's part of it. So that it just reminded me of that. So I think, there are legitimate grievances that this Russian propaganda is playing into. I don't think it's dumb propaganda. And I think this whole, it works together. Like, if they just want to topple the government, this propaganda line also makes sense. So, I don't believe they wanted a full-on invasion. Now, there's the third goal, which is forcing neutrality, which is actually, I mean, there are negotiations right now between the Russians and the Ukrainians where that is actually, I think, on the table, where the Russians say, we're going to stop this war if you give us commitments that you will never join NATO. I don't think this was Putin's war goal on the outset, because I don't think it makes sense for him to demand that. Like, to start the negotiations and demand, like, I mean, he's demanding neutrality now, but, like, I mean, it is to switch it the other way. Like, if you wanted to have negotiations and demand his actual war goal, which I think is his actual war goal, right? Demand that the government surrenders. You can't do that in negotiations. He knows that. He can only achieve that by force. So I think that's what he's trying to do. That is his main goal, achieving that by force. I think this is... I spilled beer. It's time for the beer sock again. No, I'm actually gonna take a towel here, and if you're listening to the podcast, this will be seamlessly over in just about a second. If you're watching the stream, it won't be. Look, We have an old towel. We can fix this. Sometimes I think I have Italian genes because I'm not only gesticulating wildly with my hands, but I talk even with my feet. So I kicked over a beer bottle. Anyway, what was I saying? Before that, I might as well put the rest of the beer into my tankard. Yeah, so I think this is like his fallback option. I think he didn't set out. It makes little sense to start a war to force neutrality like this, I think. Swiss is already making fun of the beer sock again. The famous beer sock. I don't think that makes sense. I think it makes sense that this he's keeping his options open, right? If things go bad for him, or if he sees, okay, we can get those commitments, then might as well stop the war. The reason why I don't think that this was his initial goal, because I think a commitment like this is worth as much as the paper is written on, right? You can always renege on commitments. Just like the Russians said, to Ukraine, you give us back our nuclear weapons and we'll never attack you. And 20 years later or whatever, that's just worth nothing. And I kind of think he doesn't really need this neutrality. I mean, I think he's going to enforce neutrality. I think that's like where the fallback goal comes in, right? That's where the occupy the East thing comes in, because by doing that, and he's done that pretty much by starting the invasion, I feel, by just getting across the border. What he does, he's occupying this. He might as well pull his forces back now, and then even without the negotiations, even without conquering Kiev, just leave his troops in like the Donbass region and the stuff they've conquered in the south, and then just sit there. And he'll have the goal that Ukraine will not join NATO, because in the moment they do, it's war, and NATO doesn't want that. And Putin can always, threaten another invasion, right? He's got his troops right there. So I think he kind of has that already, and I think that is the way in which he wants to enforce this neutrality. I think that's his goal. Like, his goal is to topple the government and then have a fallback. That's why they not only invaded towards Kiev, but that's why the consolidation movement, right, coming south and then going east towards the Donbass and subduing Mariupol, like basically bombing it to rubble. That's why they did that. To consolidate there and to never, like, even if the war grinds to a halt, to never leave that area and just stay there. I think he's already achieved this minimum. I think this is a win-win situation with Putin, because he's already achieved this very minimum goal just by starting the war, right? Just by escalating, or starting the war is wrong because the war's been going on since 2014, but by escalating that war to the invasion, he's already kind of gotten his minimum goal. And I think that is something that the West will have to come to terms with. I think there is no danger at all for Putin militarily here. I don't think they see Ukraine and the Ukrainian military as a major threat. I think that is a good assessment. I don't think anything the West does, sending them tanks, planes, mercenaries, weapons, whatever, is going to change that. I think the Russians, if they want to, they can drag this war on for a decade and just grind them down. Militarily, no matter what my colleagues in the media tell you, how many tanks the Russians lose, like, oh, they're only driving along the roads, all this kind of crap. Do you really think the Russian military is that inept? Right? I mean, I kind of in my article here, I went into a little side rant because, like, I think it's very, very arrogant for Western observers to comment on this like this, especially for once in Germany, right? Because I mean, the German military is like, we can't. Our tanks don't work. Our planes don't work. Our fucking G36 rifle doesn't work. We've got problems everywhere, and like the only military engagement the Bundeswehr has had in the last 20 years was sitting in compounds in Afghanistan, and not even being able to just do any missions without the US like giving them actual support. Whereas the Russian military, if you look at the last 20-ish years, right, they fought major engagements in Dagestan, Chechnya, Georgia, in the North Caucasus, which is kind of Chechnya and Dagestan again, Ukraine, Syria, and most recently in Central Africa. They've actually had time to, I don't know, for lack of a better term, practice war. I think they know what they're doing. Yes, they probably made a lot of mistakes here, but I don't think they're as inept as, you know. I mean, it's kind of fucking journalists in the news, but it's propaganda. It's like it's our propaganda, right? We're kind of, the Russians are idiots. I mean, it's kind of weird. They're kind of trying to brand Putin at the same time like kind of like an evil genius, kind of like Hitler. And then at the same time, they're kind of trying to brand like him and his military leadership as idiots who don't even know how to use their weapons, right, or their equipment correctly, or their resources. Where I think I err on the side of that they don't care about people losing people, and they don't care about losing this fucking equipment, which is like outdated equipment, or just losing equipment in general. That's just what the Russian military has done the last 300 years in wars, just throwing people and equipment at somebody until they just falter, because they can't keep it up. And, you know, they're just not like, Ukraine can't possibly win this. I mean, they're not like, Russia has a massive military industrial complex. Like, if you have heard of things like the Kalashnikov concern, right? The government companies who built the tanks, it's like the US, right? They built their own stuff. Ukraine, anything they have was either inherited from the Russians or bought from Germany, from the UK, from the US, right? They don't have an industry that can just like, if Germany was at war and we could hold, which we couldn't, because like we can't win a conventional war against the Russians because they'll just conquer half the country, because you can't hold the northern German lowlands. But you know, if we were in a war again, we have Rheinmetall, we have steelworks. Okay, not as much as we used to have, but you know, we can actually fucking build weapons if we have to. Like, we don't have to buy everything from, like, Ukraine they can't win this war no matter what anybody tells you. It's just not possible. Now, this very attitude that the Russians have with destroying shit at the enemy is, I think, what could be Putin's downfall. I think what his downfall could be, which I didn't go into this article, and I'm probably going to try to write something else about, but it's very hard. It's even harder than figuring out what's going on in Ukraine, is he could lose public opinion in Russia, right? Which is currently on his side, no matter who you ask. Like, even American polling institutes say it's like 50 to 70% of Russians support this war. It doesn't really matter why. Largely propaganda, not enough information. It doesn't really matter. It's also national pride, which is very prevalent. It's like historical understanding, which is lacking, because I think Russia never worked through the Stalinism and the Soviet Union. It wasn't like a denazification like in Germany, right? Where in Germany, first of all, we had a denazification after the war, and then we had a generation, like the generation of my parents, my grandfather's generation. My grandfather was in the Waffen-SS. So my parents, his daughter, my mother, rebelled against that massively, right? And that was like the peace movement in the 70s and whatever. And those people went into, like, those people became teachers in schools. So we had a generation after generation that was taught about Nazi Germany, and there's a lot of the German curriculum is like dominated by that. So as a society, we worked through this. We worked through World War II. We taught our children, what Hitler did and what Germany did wrong and what we should never do again, which is failing now apparently because people want us to enter this war, which, is just the opposite of what we should be doing. But if you have history in mind. But like the Russians never had that. They never worked through that. So they still have a very strong nationalism. To them, Stalin is still a national hero to many Russians. They never worked through all of that. So I think that's also in Putin's favor here. But he could lose the public opinion, certainly. If the body bags start piling up at home, that could turn on him. And he I don't think it's so likely that he'd get ousted by a public movement, by citizens, but more by people inside his regime, right? Kind of like how Russian Soviet leaders got kind of replaced from within the regime when, Stalin being an exception, he just died. But later on, that could certainly happen. But I think it's going to be much lower than you think, right? In writing about this, I was thinking about the Vietnam War and how much resistance there was against the Vietnam War in the American public and how long it took for this resistance actually to force the government to do something about the war. Just imagine something like this. And then we're talking democracy with free press and all that, right? And a lot less, the Americans always had a lot of pro-war propaganda, which, they probably wouldn't term propaganda, but it is exactly that. But it was a much freer society than Russia is today. So I think it would actually take longer there. So I think this is actually, this approach of just not caring about losing people could actually be Putin's downfall. But I don't think it's as likely as many Western observers see it to be. And I think it would also take a lot longer. But I think that would be the way to stop this war. I think it can only really be, it could be negotiated. There could be basically if the Ukrainians give in, that is a way. But to really stop it from the Russian side, I don't think it takes military. It's not going to be stopped militarily. It's going to be stopped politically from within the citizenry of Russia, but most likely from within Putin's own regime. Either by replacing Putin or by convincing him that he's losing support and that he needs to stop this war. I would like to write about and also record an episode of the show on how likely that is. But that's incredibly difficult. It is incredibly difficult to get any feeling of what actually Russian people are thinking about this. Of course, we do have Russian producers. One very well. I've been using his forum name a lot recently because I don't really want to, unless he explicitly says so, I don't want to use his real name because I think he could, even though it's somewhat I think it's somewhat of the Russian version of John Smith, or Heinrich Müller in Germany or whatever. I'm hesitant to get him in trouble, but he has a very specific perspective. I think every Russian listening to his podcast, especially still listening to his podcast, is probably very much on the anti-Putin side, which is good. Don't get me wrong. That's the side to be on. But it does. I don't think it necessarily reflects the whole Russian population. And I think the German press understanding, and probably I think the same goes for the UK and the US. It's all propaganda and Putin giving a speech, and then all the people in the stadium are just there because the government. A lot of that's probably true, but they're government workers and they're forced to be there, and really. The Russians don't really agree with him, but they're just too afraid, or they just don't know. I don't think that is true. I think there's probably a lot of support for this war. Probably also based on because they don't know. A lot of people don't know the truth, right? But I mean, the same I think could be said for Germany, where there's massive support for the Ukrainian cause, where to the point I walk along my street here and several people have Ukrainian flags in the window, which, I don't think a year, so they certainly didn't do this when the war started in 2014. And I think a year ago, if you'd asked them, how do I put this diplomatically? Ukraine, wasn't exactly known to be a very trustworthy, democratic country. I mean, I have a lot of, I know very little about Ukraine. The only stuff I know is from my professional research in the last decade or so into IT security, right? And whatever I researched, ransomware, cadre groups, everybody, basically for years when we were researching stories at Heise, a colleague did a big thing about cadres, people copy. So this was a few years ago, they would copy bank cards, European, what used to be called the EC card, European bank cards, which moved, almost 20 years ago to like chips. Like, they have a magnet strip still to this day, but they also have a chip. And it, when we were researching these stories and writing about this like 5 years ago or so, or maybe even 7 years ago, something like this. It used to be that, you'd have gangs, interesting, a lot of the time based in London, who would come over here and just copy these cards, copy the magnet strips. So there was one case I also wrote about where in a big supermarket chain, I think it was Edeka, which was a franchise, an organized group went in disguised as service technicians and replaced or put a chip in the card readers. And they did this to like a big franchise supermarket because they all had the same card readers, right? So they figured that one out, and they figured out how they could just open the case very quickly, pretend to service it, put a chip in, and then, actually with a little 3G mobile modem, and they would just copy these cards as people, put them in. They can't use the strip, but the chip, but it still read the magnet strip, and they copied that information. But even back then, you couldn't use that at European banks to withdraw money because every bank everywhere in Europe would check like the chip, right? That you couldn't just use the magnet strip, get that data, copy it on a blank card, and use that to withdraw money. And they would always do this. Sorry, got a dry throat. So they would always do this, like even the groups based in the UK or whatever, or in Germany. They would work together with cyber criminals, as they like to say these days, cyber, in Ukraine. And they would just withdraw this money at Ukrainian banks. And the Ukrainian banks, I can't prove this, but I talked to a lot of experts who said they must know this, right? But if you have a bank and you withdraw money, how banks work, right? They kind of, they use the money. That's why it takes a few days for the money to arrive. If they use the money to speculate, whatever. Like, it's good for them if the money moves there, whatever. I don't know. Maybe these guys paid them. They paid people off. But so I basically knew Ukraine for just being like the hub for all kinds of cyber criminals, right? If you wanted to buy like ransomware or whatever, you'd go on a darknet thing, and then it'll come from Ukraine. It would always come from Ukraine. Sometimes we were Russians, obviously often Eastern Ukraine. Then when the conflict started in 2014, it got massively worse because obviously the Ukrainian police and authorities, who sometimes actually tried to crack down on these, couldn't do that anymore in the East. But even decades before that, if you talk to people and you talked about Ukraine and organized crime, Ukraine will always come up. You'd have a lot of illegal porn is produced there or was produced there. If there was online, somebody hired a hitman, they were almost always out of Ukraine. It was just like a massive hub for, I think, the government and the institutions there was just like completely corrupt, I think, in many cases. So I don't know. Like, as horrible as this war is, and as much as Putin is at fault, and as much as, you can't just say, okay, they had a corrupt government that with lots of crime, so anybody can invade them. This is of course not true, but like I find it a weird country to like just be unconditionally of the side of, like, and send weapons to, for example. Right? Because you just know that these gangs there still exist. And I mean, okay, they handed out weapons on the street, so they probably have all the AKs they need. But now they probably also have East German, formerly East German rockets or whatever that we sent them. And I think that's just like, that's the German propaganda, right? So what I was trying to say is like, we have this too. Like in the German media, just saying, we always unconditionally side with Ukraine with anything. Now it's just as stupid as and you're just as misled as not as misled. I think the Russian public is probably misled a lot more with propaganda, but it's like it's naive to think that we don't have that over here. And like all of this stuff is now never reported. Now Ukraine is just like, just everybody there is like victims, and it's just like people are just like they're not objective about any of this, and that's the shitty thing about propaganda, and that's why I think it would be very hard. I'm gonna try, but it's gonna be very hard to like figure out what the chances are for Putin to lose this war because of the situation back home. To figure that out, what people there actually think, because I think it's like, when I think about approaching this, I think about like how hard it is for me in Germany, where we have freedom of the press and a lot of reporting, and I can just go somewhere and ask people, how hard it is for me to figure out what the German public wants, right? Because we also have our own propaganda with things like that, not even with war, right? With I mean, there's I've talked about this on the show before. There's like this understanding. There's a somewhat like the political elite, or like the Twitterati, like everybody is like, oh yeah, we need all electric cars, and we need to outlaw all petrol cars, right? But if you look into that, it becomes apparent that a lot of the German public, especially like in rural areas, people or farmers, like they're not down with this at all. But it's just not being reported on, right? And if I set myself the goal to figure out like how many people actually support something like, let's get rid of all petrol cars in the next 10 years or whatever, like that would almost be an impossible situation for me, like to figure out what the actual support of the German public would be for that, for like a situation where it's not even a war and it's in my own country and I have a lot of more ways to get information and it's just generally easier. That would be hard, very hard. So I think it's kind of impossible to figure out what the Russian public thinks about this. But I'm definitely interested. Like, if you have any information, please let me know. I'm going to talk about the feedback in a bit when I get into the feedback section. I have a whistleblower contact form that you can use completely anonymously. Please, anything helps, like any viewpoint, especially from Russians in Russia, although I do not want you to endanger yourself. The show notes have a link to a blog post where I explain how to use this safely, but always your own safety always comes first, of course. But yeah, I'm definitely interested in figuring. I think that's because that is the only way, save with diplomacy, which I don't have a lot of faith in right now, because a lot of people don't seem to be doing that. I think that's the only way for this war to end, and specifically, like, even if we get ceasefire, and Ukraine gets there's the negotiation, neutrality happens or whatever. None of that will stop Putin's approach and his belligerence, right? And his approach to geopolitics and looking at the next country, in line, I don't know, Poland or whatever. Right? The only force that can stop this permanently comes from within Russia itself. So I think that's a very important thing to figure out. It's just very hard to do. So that's kind of my long-winded way of saying, don't expect too much from that. I'm very much interested in that, but I also see the massive challenges we face in figuring that out. It's kind of like, talking about the situation on the ground in Ukraine kind of exemplifies it, how bad it is and how much propaganda is flying around and how little actual information we have, which, we live in an information age. Everybody has a smartphone and everybody can broadcast, everybody can give their opinion, but that's still negated to a large part by propaganda. And by just information overflow, we just don't know who to trust, right? If everybody can do that, we don't know. Is this actual information from the ground? Is this Russian trolls? Is this Ukrainian misinformation? What is it? Anyway, I'm going to now relatively seamless go into the feedback section because it's kind of... We're kind of talking about the same topic there. Because in the previous episode, which is 111, I also talked about the Ukrainian conflict pretty much because I talked about Facebook or Meta and their supreme hypocrisy, as I thought, in basically allowing hate speech against Russian soldiers now. And there was a very interesting discussion that Necros, a Russian producer, had with Steve B, who is, I think, originally from Canada, but now lives in the US. And who also has kind of a stake, because I think his family is from Eastern Ukraine originally. And both of them were discussing this whole thing. And it kind of spills over in what we are discussing here today. So let me first start with Necros and what he's reading, what he was commenting on the previous episode. So he says, I think it's worth noting that the whole Meta hate speech policy exemption was most probably not driven by the need to push some agenda or to signal some virtue or some such. The decision was most probably purely economically pragmatical. An average Ukrainian's post these days is somewhat along the lines of, quote, there was a bombing of the city where I'm from yesterday, my parents, close friends, favorite teacher, cousin's child died, fuck Putin, go Ukrainian armed forces, let every single invader die a horrible death as soon as possible. Somewhat understandable under the circumstances and whatnot. Had Meta held onto its hate speech policies, it would have to ban most of the Ukrainians, since the, quote, a good Russian soldier is a dead Russian soldier sentiment is widely shared among the Ukrainians these days, and they don't hesitate much to voice it. I think to avoid having to ban them all and lose the market, that the infamous exemption was introduced. I think you're not wrong. I think they did it because of that. I don't think they were pushing some agenda. I don't know if I was saying that. I certainly didn't want to, because I think in the episode I didn't really get into why they did this, because I don't fucking care. The thing is, I don't think it's as economically driven as you think, because it's Ukraine. In the greater scheme of things, Facebook could just, Meta could just kick every Ukrainian off Facebook and they wouldn't even notice, with billions of people on there. But the thing is, why I objected to this is that, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later here as well, but this is while it's understandable that Ukrainians have this reaction, I think, of course, it is sad because, I mean, this is what war does, right? It leads to hate on the other side, and then that leads to action, and then it leads to more hate, and then you have this circle that if nobody ever breaks it, it's just going to go on forever. But, you know, that's just the way it is. But, like, the thing with, like, the hate speech policy is that it was, like, hate speech policies, especially by people like Facebook, was always sold as a moral thing, right? Facebook was saying, because it was pressured largely by my colleagues in the press to, like, stop, like, to fight this hate speech, and they were saying, yes, they were clearly saying it's a moral thing. It's like, we want to do the right thing, right? And the thing with morals is you just can't turn on a dime like that, because if your whole argument is that you are banning hate speech because hate is bad, you can't then go, yes, hate is bad, but not this hate. That was my whole point. I mean, you can do that, and they did. I was just saying we can't let them get away with this, because it shows that the whole it shows what I was saying from the beginning. There isn't a moral reason to ban this kind of speech. There are other reasons, political reasons, or, you know, if you want to go with Necros's argument, economic reasons. But it doesn't matter. It means that their justification for doing it was a farce from the beginning. That was basically what I was pointing out. Anyway, Steve B responded to this and said, very good point, but in the Middle East, many countries would say the same about the West, and that would be hate speech. I.e., you know, if you're from Syria and you say, like, or like Afghanistan, the fucking Americans attacked us without provocation, they just fucking invaded us, you know, death to all Americans, then that certainly would be hate speech. And that's not justice. You know, it's the kind of thing that I talked about in one episode, like law and justice, or like basically rules and justice, right? It's not that like if you ban this kind of speech and you want justice, then you have to ban all kinds of, like, you know, and I mean, this is not a new problem. Like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a very good example for this, where, like, a lot of times, especially in Germany, it'd be like, you know, saying death to all Palestinians would be treated massively differently than saying death to all Israelis, right? Even though it's the same, it's literally the same hate speech. It's like the same thing, but, like, for historic reasons, Germans just I mean, understandable historic reasons, but just it's not just if you go, like, one is worse than the other, because you're calling on people to be killed just because they have a certain nationality, right? So yes, Steve B says, I think we have another case of them just continually moving the bar, whether we like it or not, or whether it benefits us or not. Bars need to be set and then not moved. Basically, they have just told us that they get to decide at whim what is considered hate speech, and that's exactly the point, right? So basically, what we're doing here is we're giving companies, like our states, like in my case Germany, in your case whatever, the US or wherever you are, our states are giving a company the right to, like, this is not I've thought about this before. The argument, this is our platform, we can do what you want, just doesn't go anymore. This is for sense of better term, it's like the public, right? This is like where public opinion gets formed, and we're giving control of that to a company, and we're saying they can now decide, you know, what is illegal and what is not, like what gets banned and what you can say and what you can't say. And while that is one thing, if they just do that impartially, it's bad enough as it is, because, as I was pointed out, in Germany we have laws against hate speech. Facebook should get the fuck off regulating any of this. It's the government's, like, it's literally the government's job. The government made a law and said this is hate speech, and our courts decide this, so it's their fucking job. It's not Facebook's job, right? Facebook doesn't get to pull, like, if there's people standing across the road from the Facebook headquarters throwing stones in the windows. Facebook doesn't get to have a private police force and just beat them to pulp. They have to call the state. They have to call the German police, and they have to take care of it. So that's what should apply here too. And it gets worse if they just make a mockery. Like if we give them that right and they make a mockery of that process by like at the first sign of trouble just turning around and just completely showing that justice is really not what they want. Like they're going for the path of least resistance probably, but that's not, like if you're trying to make moral decisions and you're claiming to be just and doing that's not what you do. Right? So Necros was against that. He sorry about this. So Necros was against that. He replied and said, "No, times change, people change, society changes, and bars need to be moved to reflect that. We don't throw stones at women who dare to fuck without being married. It depends on the country. We don't burn people for not sharing our religions." Depends on no, they're just stoning them as well. And we allow black people and white people to use the same toilets. These bars have gradually moved, and it's a good thing. Actually, that's very, very US. In other countries that was never in. But that's a different argument. Steve B replied, while it does need to change, it needs thought and oversight. So the kind of change I'm against is my neighbor upset me, so I'm changing a rule. In our current world, both sides of every dispute are running large disinformation campaigns, and while the media should maintain neutrality, they have been picking sides and fueling the campaigns. Actually, this is kind of moving the discussion into another direction, because actually at this point we want to talk about the media, but Facebook, which, it's enjoying, especially in the US, certain protections against being sued, specifically because they're not the media and they're not supposed to editorialize. But I like this. Of course, we have to move lines and rules in society, right? And of course, like moral standards change, and that is good. But they can move to both sides, right? Where Necros talks about stuff like moving it in the right direction, slavery, whatever. They can also move in the other direction, which in Russia is happening, for example, right? There's countries, Turkey, right, where they move in the other direction, in the direction we don't want, where a very secularized country suddenly becomes a religious fanatic country, or the government at least. So, moving that is not always good. And also, you have to be very careful. I'm with Steve B on this. You have to think about this, right? And this is why, for example, this is why we have constitutions, right? Because in a modern democracy, the way things should work is that the laws are malleable, right? The politicians you vote for make the laws, which means, it's not that easy, and there's more layers, but like generally a democracy works in a way where the majority of the people change the laws, in the direction they want. So laws can be changed if everybody says, our moral standards change, we need to change this. Now, because certain things shouldn't be changed, because they're never really changed, because they're morally relatively inflexible, or you want them to be, right? We have constitutions, which are generally designed as laws that even the government can't change. And that's their whole point, because, for example, in Germany, after Nazi Germany, we learned certain things. After Hitler, we learned certain things. We said, these rules should never be changed. There's no reason. These are morally very important rules that should be extremely inflexible, that even the government shouldn't change. And that's what we put in the Constitution. So some things just shouldn't be changed. And if you make a strong moral statement, I'm not saying it should never change, but if you go like, this is our platform, for moral reasons, we think hate speech is bad, so we are outlawing hate speech, and like calling for somebody's death is hate speech, right? And then a year later, literally a year later, whatever, you turn around and go, yeah, but we've changed our mind. In this case, calling for somebody's death is justified. That is just wrong. That is bad. And we need to, the problem is we need to call out, like, I'm not even mad at Facebook for changing the rules. I'm mad at, like, for example, journalists, like my profession, whose job it is to call something out like this. To go like, fucking, a year ago, you said you want to be morally superior and hate speech is bad. And this is why we're doing this and that and the other thing. And now you're going, well, not in this case. Like, you're a morally corrupt, morally bankrupt company. And you shouldn't be in charge of deciding things like this. And that's what the press should say. But this story wasn't even covered a lot. And then now we get into the media. I largely agree with Steve B. Here on the media should maintain neutrality. Necros says, actually questions that the media should maintain neutrality and says there's no such thing as impartial media, which is correct. A media outlet financed by some sponsor necessarily pushes the agenda of that sponsor, the agenda that sponsor desires in a more or less subtle way. A media outlet financed by consumers, the private citizen being a good example, is necessarily driven in what information it presents and how and how by the consumers, which is why I think good journalism should be supported by the people who consume it. Fab calls us all producers for a reason. Of course, he himself is also naturally a producer, yeah, and his is the biggest contribution, so he has a deciding voice. And also somebody kind of has to, otherwise it's chaos. If a media outlet is sponsored by its consumers and the consumers demand neutral balanced coverage, then and only then it can and should maintain neutrality. In all other cases, I seriously doubt maintaining neutrality is possible or desirable. Well, I generally agree with what Necros says here. And of course, I've talked about this a lot. Like, you can't be objective as a journalist and you can't be neutral, but you should strive to, right? And that's why you lay down your biases, which I did, like in episode 100 for a long time for you guys, so you know where I'm coming from. And I believe you should strive for neutrality. And I think when Necros says the consumers have to demand that, I think they generally do. I think most of media consumers, most of readers, viewers, listeners want their media to be as impartial as it can be. They just don't have a chance in the current climate, because media is largely supported by advertising, which is why I don't like that model. And then we have completely different cases where, yes, in case of the private citizen, I think you want that. This is why I created the show. That's the premise of the show. But if you look for the public broadcasting in Germany, the public broadcasting system in Germany has a state mandate. And that's why the state collects money on behalf of this. Like, you're forced as a German citizen, kind of like the BBC license, to pay for this broadcasting with the explicit legal mandate to be neutral. That is their mandate, and they're not neutral, right? So in the example we have today, in the war of Ukraine and Russia, they are very much on the Ukrainian side, which is understandable. Like, personally, morally, I'm also on that side. Yes, I am rooting for the Ukrainians in this war. But if I'm a journalist and I'm trying to give you as close to the facts as I can, as I see them, that gets in the way, right? Because then I'm more inclined to believe Ukrainian propaganda, for example, government propaganda, which could be a lie. So I'm misinforming my audience, right? Or I start believing that militarily the Ukraine can beat Russia, even though all the data I have is pointing the other direction. Like, even if I'm personally rooting for Ukraine, if I'm reporting on this, I'm trying to divorce myself from that. And which makes the cover. I think that makes the coverage better for you. I mean, and you don't even have to go into war. It's kind of the same thing with the Drachenlord situation. I think most of the media in Germany is on his side. They sympathize with his plight. Maybe because they haven't watched enough of his videos. I don't know. But like that leads to a misunderstanding of the situation on the ground and just leads to you just giving your audience wrong information. Because you're biased, and everybody's biased, but like you have to see your own bias, right? It's not so bad if you're biased and if you know about it and you put it in your reporting. And it's also okay if that gets balanced out, because like if at a given publication you had 20 reporters and 15 of them are pro-Ukrainian and 5 of them are more, they are not even pro-Russian, but they understand the Russian side a bit more, then you'd have balanced reporting. You still have more pro-Ukrainian people, but like you'd have articles that balance each other out. But we just don't have that on the media. Like even if that's the thing today, you're just not, as a reporter in the newsroom, you're just afraid probably you would not write this more pro-Russian article you wanted to write, because that's how you see the situation, because you'd get like shouted down and you get shunned by all your colleagues, right? Like the article I wrote for my newsletter on analyzing Putin's war goals, I could not write that at a German newspaper, right? It's in English, but in German I could not write that because everybody in the newsroom would probably go, well, this sounds pro-Putin, which it isn't. It's just a very unemotional analysis, but like that's the way it sounds if you're pro-Ukrainian, and then you can't publish that basically because you get strongly dissuaded from that, or you just like your editor just goes, we're not publishing this. So yeah, I think that is kind of the problem. Steve B also replied to Necros saying, for me, this winds it up now, but like I think generally consumers want neutrality. Or at least they want a balanced view, right? I mean, it's okay to read in publication that is on the one side, as long as you still have the option of reading the other side. There's also many consumers who don't want that, who just want the apparently they're okay with the emotional, we're all gonna die, or we're all on this side thing. They just don't want to be well informed. You just can't help these people. But anyway, Steve B had a nice, the discussion was, there's a lot more of this discussion on the forum. There's a link in the show notes if you want to read all of it. But I think Steve B put a nice end to it, put a nice cap on it when he said, for me, this all boils down to there being two sides, but the current systems will side with one side and demonize the other side, no matter which side is correct. This is why I like your statement of letting people decide for themselves, but these days our media is dictating to too many people what they are to decide, and not giving them the information required to actually think for themselves, or actually decide for themselves. And I agree with this very much. That is very much the problem in a nutshell, right? There's too many articles out there. You should do, like, there literally now are articles you should, like, and it's not even like politics or it's everywhere. It's not only in politics, it's in fucking sports, it's in gaming, right? There's articles. So I play Elden Ring right now, which is a fascinating game, and then I read like an article you're playing Elden Ring wrong, or this is not what kind of an, I just don't understand the attitude of these, I'm going to put it in air quotes, journalists who write this, because you're writing like a fucking school teacher. You're so condescending to your fucking audience. What the hell's wrong with you? Like, I have my opinion, I have my analysis, I just gave you my analysis, but I don't presuppose that's what you think, you should think. And I always say, please write to me if you don't, because I find the discussion interesting. I don't want to be in a bubble where everybody just thinks the same thing. And I would never presuppose, I've never written an article, I've written thousands of articles in my now 10 years of professional journalism. I've written thousands of articles, probably tens of thousands. And I've done so many podcast episodes, never have I at least wanted to if I did, I didn't mean to, and I'm ashamed for that if I did. But like I never write or talk like you should think that, and this is the correct way to think or to do something. That's not what a journalist does. That's what a propagandist does, or a PR person, or a teacher. And once you get to university, your teacher basically shouldn't do that anymore either. Like what I'm trying to do here is create content for people who'd be happy at university. Where at least when I went to university, I don't know how it's these days, but the whole point was to encourage you to think for yourself. The point of university is to give you the tools, sapere aude, dare to think, dare to question, to give you the tools to do that, to think critically, to figure out where information is. But to debate everything, to debate with your fellow students, to debate with your professors, that's the whole point. And that's what I want to do here. But anyway, this whole discussion went on for a bit more, and it's like really nice at the end. Basically, I enjoyed this discussion very much because you had two people here, one from North America, one from Russia, with very different viewpoints, discussing this very calmly and very civilized, and then in the end, basically agreeing that war is shit, and that all of us, no matter what country we are, our tax dollars are currently being spent on building weapons and sending weapons somewhere. I mean, obviously for the guy in Russia, but also for me in Germany and people in the US. And our tax dollars are now being all spent on war, whereas we, listening to this podcast all over the world, all of us, we don't want that. We fucking hate war. And I have good friends in Russia. I don't know if anybody listening to this in Ukraine, but it would be nice if I had friends in Ukraine, or at least listeners in Ukraine. I have friends all over the world, and just because I don't like what my government does and their government does doesn't mean like we have to fall prey to all this propaganda. And I think this discussion showed this very well, that across all these borders we can still agree that, for example, all our governments are shit and they're doing shitty things here, and we don't want this war. And that was thought it was a nice end to the discussion, and it's probably a nice end to this show. So, if you have a different viewpoint, I would like to hear it. Go to privatecitizen.press, contact link in the top. There's contact information in every individual show note probably under producer feedback at the bottom. It explains how to contact me, and also if you are in Russia, use the whistleblower contact form. It the page links to a blog post where I write about how I set this up, what it is, how to use it, and try to be safe, please. That's the most important thing. Anyway, speaking of producers, now we get to the point where I thank all the producers. This podcast follows the value for value model, which was pioneered by Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak on the No Agenda show, which works like this. You can become a producer of the show, and that works by either writing in and giving me, information about what's happening where you are, boots on the ground reports, by correcting mistakes I made, by giving me ideas for new episodes, all that kind of thing. But what's also, of course, needed is, monetary help, because I just can't do that without it, and I don't want this podcast to be sponsored by anybody for obvious reasons that we just discussed. So if you want to help out, you can become a patron, or you can use PayPal to just send some money over. All the details are also in the show notes, privatecitizen.press. And with that, I would like to thank everybody who brought you this episode. So if you enjoyed this, you will also thank these people. So everybody who supported me via Patreon and PayPal, thank you. Those people are Georges, Steve O's, Butterbeans, Michael Small, Rudain the Insane, Jonathan M. Hedhe, Michael Mullen Jensen, Dave, 1i11G, Jaroslav Lichtblau, Jackie Plage, Philipp Klostermann, IKN, Bennett Piata, Sandman 616, turned into German there, Vlad, Tobias, Mode 7, Kai Sears, Joe Poser, Fadi Mansour, Dirk Didi, Rizal, Avis, David Potter, Mika, Mr. Amish, Cam, Dave Umrish, Ricky M, Barry Williams, Jonathan, RJ Tracy, Rick Bragg, Captain Eckert, Astral C, Robert Forster, Superuser, D, and no reply. And also because I'm streaming this live on Twitch, and Twitch supporters also support this podcast as well as my gaming streams and all the other stuff I do. Thanks to my Twitch subscribers as well. Those are Mike the Dane, Jonathan MH _com, Bacon the Pork, Redeemer F, Astral C1, The Panzer, Hoover Star, Borglet, Quad Damage, Nomt 771, Halifa, Indie Game EX, who is in chat, Mode 7, Mode 7 is unavailable, Sandman 616, Luna Spork, Gal Taran, El Terrestris Jim, and Harry Vatana. Thanks to all of you. Astral C also in chat, by the way. I also have to thank Bytemark at bytemark.co.uk. They're UK cloud hosting company, and they're providing me with the bandwidth and the storage to bring you the audio files for free. I couldn't do that without them. So thanks to Bytemark, supporting free speech in a big way here. And that's it. Theme song of the show's Acoustic Roots by Raoul Kabzali. And I'm going to play you out with another song. I like to do that, a different song every episode. This is Thriving Seas by Blood Red Sun. And I'll see you soon. Probably talking about the Drachenlord. Thanks for listening. Thanks for daring to think for yourself. So aim to misbehave. And Zapore Aude.
I look the other way. I don't see how it's got anything to do with me. Oh, hurry, I need my beat. At any expense, it doesn't make sense, but every...
I think I'm gonna have to restart that. That sounds a bit too oversaturated. Let's try that again.
I look the other way. I don't see how it's got anything to do with me. Oh, hurry, I need my beat. At any expense, it doesn't make sense, but every cell in my body eats its protein. Oh, grass is only for cows and rabbits that don't know how to kill and conquer, to win and rule. Oh, it's what we learn at school. We don't worry about seas. We recycle and sort by source. We've banned all plastic straws, quit smoking. Oh, every paycheck we get, 10% is donated to clean our conscience, and it works out great. Why should we change? Sleep less, be more efficient. Come on, perform better, climb higher, educate away. I am all my degrees, my masters. Hey, look at me, I am somebody. It's what I've learned at Carbon dioxide, my conclusion that it's all a lie. Our guns are mine, we're not smart, we will survive. We've got technology, it's not a lie, we will survive. The seas are thriving, we will get by, it's not a lie.
All right. I kind of like that song. It's nicely sarcastic. Right. I'm gonna run off now and edit this show and get it out. Yeah. I am way too late on that. I really wanted to play some Elden Ring after this podcast, but I really can't. I've got work to do tomorrow. Gotta get up early and get the show out. So I'm gonna rate you over to Tiger Writer now, who's playing Elden Ring. And I'm just gonna live through him vicariously. I'm gonna get back to play that game pretty soon. But I just can't do it right now. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that or learned something or got annoyed by it, or I don't know, hope it did something for you. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it a lot, massively, and yeah, see you soon. I'll be back. I'll be back streaming. I really should get back to setting up a schedule, but things are just topsy-turvy still here at the moment. I don't know what it is. Must have been the quarantine or something. It like threw me a curveball. But anyway, I'll be back soon, also with another podcast episode. So thanks for watching, and see you soon, everybody.